Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about a video I get a lot of questions about, and that's, can you break down the differences between all the different generations of Monteros? So I have the privilege of owning all three generations of Monteros. So I've got a two-door 1984 Mitsubishi Montero. I've got a 95, that's a Gen 2, and a 2003, that's my Gen 3. And so I've got experience with all of them, and today I want to talk about some of the differences, what makes them good, what makes them bad, and if you're shopping for one, maybe this will help you understand which one you're after. Now, before I get into this, there are other generations, there are other options outside of the United States that I don't have any experience in. This video, for the purposes of what we're talking about, we are only going to talk about the cars that were offered in the United States. And so for you guys in other parts of the world, especially Australia, we don't have a diesel model, not in any of them. And so I can't help you out with that. I can't talk to you about the newer models like the Gen 4 and that kind of thing. So this is just for what we got in the United States. These are the years they were offered and that kind of thing. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what years the Gen 1, 2, and 3 were. So you've got the Gen 1, that's going to be the very first one. That's your really boxy one. Those were made from 1984 to 1992. Those come in a two-door and a four-door. They come in a V6, they come in a flat four, an auto, and a manual transmission. The one I have, one of the very first ones, it's a 1984. It's a two-door, it's a stick shift, and it has the four-cylinder 2.6 liter motor. Your second generation, or your Gen 2, that's going to be 1993 to 2000. And I've got down here that they made a different kind of body style change in 98, 99, and 2000. That's what people call the Gen 2.5. It's got a little boxier flares. People really like it. It had some drive chain changes, but by and large, it's the same construction as the Gen 2 with a little more attractive body on top of it. Then you get into your Gen 3, that's going to be from 2001 to 2006. There are slight changes with the drivetrain as well as the engine and transmission and that kind of thing. But by and large, the body style stays the same and the platform stays the same all the years from 2001 to 2006. So those are our years. That's what we're working with. Now let's get into some comparisons. All right, so first off, we're going to talk about how these things perform off-road. Now, there's a huge difference between how something performs on-road and off-road, obviously, and so I want to talk about the things that just make up the off-road experience. We'll get into things like comfort and modability and that stuff later, but this is just looking at the basic cars, how do they perform off-road. It's also worth mentioning, I'm going to talk mostly from experience. So there's other forms of these, like they have different gear ratios and different engine options, that kind of thing, that I'm not going to go into all the different options for these. I'm going to talk about the ones I have, the setups that they have, and how they perform off-road. So we're going to look at all three generations. We're going to look at a couple different subjects here. We got suspension, engine, transmission, transfer case and the differentials, the ground clearance issues, and flex. So let's start from the top here. Let's go through all of it, and then we'll talk about which ones are going to be the best. So in the Gen 1, my Gen 1 is leaf sprung in the rear and independent front suspension that's run by torsion bars. Some of the Gen 1s, they came with coil springs. Mine is leaf sprung. The Gen 2 that I have, that's a 95 SR, it's got coil springs in the rear, IFS in the front, and again, that's going to be torsion bars. It's basically the same setup, just a little beefier because it's a bigger car. The Gen 3 is the one that's really different here. You've got IFS and independent rear suspension. You've got a conventional strut, a McPherson strut in the front. That's going to be more common to most cars nowadays. And you have a coil spring and a shock in the rear. Now, when you're looking at this kind of suspension, obviously this is the older kind of suspension and it gets more comfortable as it gets newer. However, it doesn't necessarily get better for off-roading. And so I think the sweet spot of all of this is actually going to be the Gen 2. I think it's got the best suspension options. Part of that's the longer wheelbase. The leaf springs are all right. They actually flex pretty well. They offer a pretty good off-road experience. But as far as the suspension goes, this is going to give you the most travel, the most movement, the most flexibility is going to be the Gen 2 package. So that's my choice for the best suspension. Now, when we talk about the engine, this is a big deal for off-roading because if you're going to put big tires on it, if you're going to climb up big hills, you've got to have the power to move it. And so I mentioned before, I've got the 2.6. I said flat four. It's an inline four. There's no boxer motor in mine. So this is the 2.6 inline four. This thing is a dog. It's pretty slow. I've got a Weber carburetor on it and that kind of thing, and it still doesn't move very fast. Then I've got the 3.5 double overhead cam V6 in my Gen 2. This is a very complicated motor that doesn't make a lot of ponies. I've rebuilt the entire thing And it still just does not have the grunt. It doesn't really want to go anywhere. Match that with the transmission, and it's really a bad combo. We'll talk about that in a second. So this one, lot of motor, not a lot of power, at least in this combination. And then this one's going to be the best one right here. This is my Gen 3 with the 3.8 single overhead cam V6. This motor has got a little bit of flack because it's got a little bit of finesse to how you set it up and that kind of thing, especially with the butterfly valves. But this motor makes a decent amount of power. It's only 0.3 cubic centimeters bigger, or 0.3 liters, sorry, bigger than this one, but it makes way more power, way more usable, way more low-end torque. And so that's my choice for off-roading, because the engine does a lot of work. You don't have to strain it as much, and you don't have to compensate with gears, which leads me into the transmission. So transmission, I mentioned that I have a manual 5-speed in my Gen 1. I really like that, even though the transmission is basically made of glass. They do not like a lot of abuse, so you can't hammer on them. Thankfully, the motor is really small, so it can't do that much. But you put big tires on it, you start to run into issues. I've already rebuilt that once. But this one's okay. This auto 4-speed in my Gen 2, I hate it. The first gear is not low enough. So it's fine for cruising around in the city, but you get it off-road and you can actually stall it out on the torque converter if you don't have the right gears, where it's in 4 low, you're giving it gas, and it still doesn't want to overcome the torque converter. And so I think this is a terrible transmission for off-roading. It's probably my least favorite part of this car. Which leads me to the best transmission here, which is going to be the auto 5-speed in the Gen 3. That first gear is way lower, and it has another gear, so it's got a little more variation in the gear ratios to make sure you're always right in that sweet spot. I use this car for all sorts of things. So it'll tow, it'll do 80 miles an hour on the highway, and then you get it in the rocks and it really crawls. So the winner for me is again going to be this combination right here, the 3.8 V6 and the auto 5-speed. That's the sweet spot for me as far as off-roading goes. But you can make up for a lot of this stuff, the bad motor and the transmission, if you have good gears. So again, I've done a ton of modification to my vehicles to change the gears, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to talk about like stock from the factory. What do we have in the cars? So we're going to look at two things, the transfer case and the differentials, because those are the two gears that make the biggest difference when you're off-roading. So the Gen 1, first of all, it's going to have a manual transfer case, just like the Gen 2, and it's going to give you 2 high, that's the rear wheel drive, 4 high, that's going to be 4 high and locked, so it's the center differential is locked, and 4 low. So just 3 options, but those are most of the ones you need. Comes with a 4.6 gear ratio, which actually works pretty well for turning bigger tires and working in this combination. Overall, I think it actually feels pretty healthy with this gear ratio. It doesn't feel like it needs a whole lot more, and so I think that's a good fit for it. The LSD, limited slip differential, really helps with off-roading. It's kind of an effortless thing to keep the tires together. Obviously not as good as a locker, but it's pretty good. When we jump into the Gen 2, we gain a couple things here. First one is it's also manual. You get 2 high, you get 4 high, which is actually more like all-wheel drive. And so that puts a limited slip between your front and rear tires, which is great for driving around in ice and snow, where you don't actually want to have it all the way locked. You can drive it around in all-wheel drive. I call it big Subaru mode. So you got 2-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, 4 high locked center. That's the same as 4 high on this, where the center differential is locked. And then you have 4 low. You also have a 4.6 gear ratio, especially in mine, that's the SR version. Some of them came with a 4.3, that one is worse. And then this one has the addition of a rear locker. The SR version gives you a rear locker, really strong diffs, really strong differentials, and that's a huge advantage. Being able to lock up the rear end makes this a much more capable off-roader. In addition, having all-wheel drive helps you on gravel roads. So you can just put it in all-wheel drive on gravel roads, you can bomb down, you don't have to worry about turning or anything like that. It really works well. And so I think this is a really good combination. Then we get over to the Gen 3, and that's where things get modern and worse. So you have the same combinations here, 2 high all-wheel drive, 4 high locked center, and 4 low. You have a 4.3 diff gears, which is not great. The 5-speed transmission, those kind of help. But then you get into the negatives. The first thing is the diffs are open. So there's no locker and there's no LSD in there. It's electronic, which means instead of manually shoving a lever forward and changing the gears, you're relying on a motor inside the transfer case to shift for you. This is controlled by all sorts of electronics and sensors, and it has a tendency to fail. I've made a couple of videos about that, so I won't get into it here, but this adds a layer of complexity that I really don't like. When you're in an off-road situation, when you really need this stuff to work, I've been locked in 4 low, I've been locked out of 4 low, I've had the traction control go out, all things that I needed on the trail right there. I wasn't able to fix it, wasn't able to diagnose it. That's not a good time. So this part really here, this really bugs me. But it also has traction control. Now, traction control is a little different. It kind of works like A-Track in a Toyota. Basically, what it does is it sends power to the wheels that have traction. And that's actually pretty good. And I've fooled a lot of people into thinking that I either have a limited slip or a rear locker in this car. It can get way further than you'd expect for open differentials. And so when all of this is working, traction control is amazing. Like, it will make you look like a way better driver. It'll get you out of situations that you're like, I have no idea how I'm gonna make it out of here. It really is awesome. However, like I said, it's electronic, so if it fails, you're totally hosed. And so you don't want to get into a situation where you need traction control, have it go out, and not be able to get out. That's where something like a mechanical limited slip or a rear locker, rear air locker, and having the manual transfer case is a huge advantage. It's worth mentioning this one has the smallest diffs out of this as far as like a ring gear and the actual diameter. And then these two use the same, basically the same center section, basically the same ring gear size. I would say that they are about the same as far as their strength. However, I have to give the winner to this one right here. I think having all these options is awesome. The rear locker and the manual transfer case really puts it over the edge for me. I think that's the winning combination. Okay, let's talk about ground clearance issues. Obviously, some of these things can be fixed with wheels and tires that are gonna put you either wider or taller, and then a lift obviously is really gonna help. But as far as the body geometry that these have, they all suffer in the same way, which is that their departure angle is bad. Monteros have a great approach angle, which means you can get up a lot of stuff, but then you drag the rear end going up, or you go down something and you drag the rear end coming off of it. The rest of it is tucked up pretty good. There's not a whole lot of low-hanging stuff, but the rear end is the downfall. So let's talk about what's in the rear end. On my Gen 2, the wheels are so far back, it doesn't actually matter. It does pretty good. By the time you get off of something with the rear wheels, you're pretty much on the hitch, if that. So I actually think that one's pretty good. With the small tires that come on it from the factory, you're gonna bump into a lot of stuff. Throw some big tires on it, good to go. The problem with the Gen 2 is that the last point on the body is the gas tank. So if you're coming off of something and you drop the rear end down, you're hitting your gas tank. And you never want to hit your gas tank. Worst case scenario, you punch a hole in it, you leak out all your fuel, could cause a fire, would leave you stranded. Another situation is you smash your gas tank and the shock wave actually takes out your fuel pump, also leaving you stranded. Either way, you just don't want to smash that thing. So it sucks to have the worst point in your car have something so valuable. If it was just like a spare tire back there or just frame section, go ahead, drag it on a rock. But you want your gas tank. And so to have that back there, that's a huge pain. Obviously, skid plates and a lift makes a huge difference. There's other mods you can do, but that's worth mentioning. The rear end as a whole is the weakness for the Gen 3. So the gas tank's been moved on this. It's still a ground clearance issue, but you're not gonna clock it as much. But the bumper cover and some of the things that are hanging down like lights, and then there's a storage compartment for the third row seat, is all down there in the rear end, and I smash that thing almost every time I go off-road. I've got a bunch of lift in it. I've tried to get it as high as possible, and I still smash it. To the point where right now I've just left it, I've sealed it all up, it's all bent and mangled. I can't seem to not hit that thing. So it's really annoying, and I've tried to get it up out of the way. But when I had it in stock form, I ripped the bumper cover off and broke the lights all the time. So it's worth mentioning they kind of all have the same issues. The Gen 1 is probably the winner here for me on ground clearance. Keep in mind, you can do modifications, especially to the Gen 2, to get that up out of the way, and I don't currently have any ground clearance issues on my Gen 2. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room. That'd be flex. A good off-road vehicle can flex. That's gonna allow you to keep your tires on the ground. It's gonna keep you from tipping over. That's really good. Monteros kind of suck at flex. It's just how it is. Get a Jeep, get a solid axle, it's better. With the IFS, it's just gonna be limiting. So as far as flex goes, I'll just tell you, this is the Gen 1 is good, the Gen 2 is best, and the Gen 3 is flat out bad. Most of that has to do with the independent rear suspension on the Gen 3. It just doesn't want to flex. It'll lift a tire and drive through no problem, but it doesn't want to flex and keep the tires on the ground. Even though the Gen 1 has leaf springs, it does a pretty good job flexing. It makes it a much more capable off-roader to be able to put those tires down, especially with the limited slip. But the Gen 2 expands on that. The torsion bars are about the same as the Gen 1, but the coil springs and the way they have the independent or the suspension in the rear setup lends itself a lot better to a lot more flex. So that's where I'd put these things as far as off-road. Now, if we just add this up, you can see that I've got 3 stars here on Gen 2, 2 for Gen 3, and 1 for the Gen 1. Now, the Gen 1 only gets a star because it doesn't smash things. That's not that good. My pick for an off-roader is gonna be the Gen 2. That's my go-to because I think the things that really matter are gonna be this flex and the running gear you have in your diffs and transfer case. That's gonna be the most important thing. The motor and the transmission, obviously, if you could swap these into here, you'd have like the perfect car. But I think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks in this case, and the Gen 2's my pick for off-roading. So now let's talk about what it's like to not be off-road, but be in the car on a regular day. All right, so even though you want to be off-road all the time in your Montero, reality is you still got to drive it on the road. Whether it's actually your daily driver or you're just trying to get to the trail, I think it's worth pointing out some of the comfort features of each Montero. So again, we got Gen 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at the overall comfort. We're going to look at some of the amenities that are offered. We're going to look at the road trip ability of each car, the towing, not the capacity, but the experience, and the miles per gallon. So let's start over here with the Gen 1. This will be no surprise because it's the older car. It is rough, it is loud, and it is very basic on the inside of this vehicle. There's not a whole lot of comfort built in. It is a solid steel box. And so it wasn't designed for comfort. The ride is pretty rough. It's not that forgiving. A lot of shakes, a lot of sounds, a lot of wind noise coming through all the windows. So it's a very rough ride, very loud, very basic on the interior. Very little sound deadening, that kind of thing. Overall comfort in the Gen 2 when you're just driving down the road, you do get a little bit of body roll. It's definitely better than the Gen 1. It rides like a body on frame vehicle. So that's gonna be like your trucks or that kind of thing. So it's a little more rigid, so you get a little more feedback from the road. It's not gonna be as nice and forgiving. But that being said, that's not always a bad thing, but it does add to kind of the NVH of the whole thing. And this is an interesting one is it doesn't have any usable cup holders. They've got these little tiny ones that go like in the center armrest, but like nothing except for a Coke can fits in there. And so they're totally useless, which you would think, who cares if it has cup holders? But once you go without them, you realize it's super annoying. My Gen 1 also doesn't have cup holders, but it's worth mentioning in a more modern car, super annoying not to have them. Which brings us to the Gen 3. Gen 3 is going to win here because it's actually a unibody construction. So I mentioned here this is body on frame. It means the body of the car is dropped onto the frame of the vehicle. This one is a unibody, which is built how most normal cars are. Now the interesting thing about this unibody is some people call it a monocoque structure, which is for race cars, but it's very stiff. That being said, it still performs better in the comfort department than your Gen 2 or your Gen 1. So it drives and feels a lot more like a car. Part of that has to do with the suspension, part of that has to do with the monobody or unibody construction. It's also got rack and pinion steering, which is what most normal cars have now. It's got a rack system that allows for a lot less slop, a lot more confidence in the steering wheel. Both of these use a traditional steering box, which is fine and it's strong, but it does not feel as planted as the Gen 3. And then it's just got a nicer interior. As things progress, they got better at making cars nicer, and so the leather in there is a little bit nicer. The overall feel of the dashboard is a little more refined, and so the Gen 3 feels the most comfortable when you get in it. You can really see how back in 2000 or 2003 or whatever, like when you got into this car, it felt like a luxury vehicle because it was meant to compete with some of those. And so in overall comfort, I'm going to give the win to the Gen 3. Now let's talk about some of the things that contribute to that overall comfort like the amenities. So, as I mentioned before, the Gen 1 has almost no amenities to it, but the ones it does have are worth mentioning because they're kind of quirky and fun. So it has side windows, and those aren't like the side windows like on the side of the vehicle, but it has ones in the front that open up, and if you are used to these, you know what they're like, but they just offer the perfect amount of breeze to come in. It's an older truck thing. A lot of the Gen 1s have it. You can crack those open. I find that to be an amenity. I really like that on a warm summer day. Additionally, it has a bouncy seat, like a semi-truck, like a school bus, like the seat has some suspension in it. So even though it's a rougher ride because of the suspension and the actual geometry of the car, the bouncy seat actually takes a lot of that out. It's super comfortable off-road with that bouncy seat. It just takes a lot of the like jolting out and kind of gives you this cushion. Would I trade it for the rest of the things? Probably not, but that's a really nice feature to have as far as amenities. Now the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 are pretty similar, although everything in the Gen 3 is going to be nicer. And so even though this is not news in today's cars, this is something that would have been pretty big for these guys. They've got power seats, power windows, they've got a leather interior, they've got an upgraded stereo, so it's nicer. Cruise control, which is good. The Gen 1 doesn't have that. It's got a sunroof, a huge sunroof at that, and it's got a third row seat. Now, it's worth mentioning, the third row seat to me is pretty much useless. If you try to fit anyone but an infant back there, it's really hard to access. It's not like having an off-road minivan. I think it was mostly just a trend of the time. I've taken the third row out of both of mine and I'm never putting it back in. That being said, the Gen 2 and the Gen 3, even though they are different in their construction, very similar in their amenities. So you could split it between the two, but I would say the Gen 3 has the better of the package. Okay, let's talk about taking these on a road trip. It's worth mentioning, I've taken the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 on pretty substantial road trips, multiple thousands of miles at a time. I've lived out of them for weeks at a time, and so I've done a lot of this. The Gen 1 I have not taken, and that's because it's just not ideal for a road trip. It doesn't want to go much over 70 miles an hour. Like I said, it's really rough and basic inside. It's just not that comfortable of a vehicle. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense for actually going somewhere. If I'm going to go somewhere far away, out of state, I want to take the more comfortable of the vehicles. So this Gen 1, not ideal for road trips, although I would like to do one just to do it someday. We'll see how that goes. The Gen 2 is pretty comfortable. This is supposed to say comfortable. It's pretty comfortable. It does pretty well. You've got a little more comfort in this, and with the cruise control and all of that, it feels more planted going down the road. I'm not opposed to doing long trips in this. I've done a handful of road trips in it, but you really start to see the difference when you compare it to the Gen 3. It's going to drive more like a car. It's a lot more comfortable to be in. It's quieter, and so this is a lot more comfortable to road trip in. You can do a lot of miles in a Gen 3. The seats are more comfortable, the ride's really forgiving. Anyone can jump in and drive. You don't have to worry about, hey, watch out, this car's got body roll, or the old steering box is a little sloppy or whatever. And so that one's my most comfortable for a road trip. Additionally, this one doesn't have a lot of space inside of it. This one has more space by a significant margin, but I think the Gen 3 actually has the most interior space for just like packing luggage and stuff. Okay, let's talk about towing. And I mentioned before, I'm not talking about towing capacity because the numbers all look relatively the same, minus the Gen 1, which is obviously going to be lower. But these all say they can tow 5,000 pounds. However, I wouldn't tow 5,000 pounds with all of them. I've done quite a bit of towing with them. Even the Gen 1, I've towed probably 2,500 pounds with my Gen 1, not very far. The longest trip I probably did was about 40, 50 minutes, and I was doing about 1,500 pounds with my Gen 1. It wouldn't go over 45 miles an hour. So this one, not great. The Gen 2, it's really not a strong suit. However, if I'm just towing a dirt bike around or a small scrap run or whatever, I expect it to tow, and it does okay. The Gen 2 is all right at towing. I talked in the last section about the transmission and the motor, and they just don't have the power to move a lot of stuff. And so you attach a trailer to this, and it is noticeably slower. Now the transmission has a towing mode, it's called power, and that allows the shift points to be a little higher. That definitely helps, but it just feels so laborious to tow anything with this. The most common thing I haul is a snowmobile trailer. It weighs about 1,500 pounds, and this one will barely do it. This one will do it, but it'll be angry about it. But the Gen 3 is for sure the best for towing. So I've actually towed this Gen 2 with this Gen 3 about 500 miles. I had it on a car dolly, so not a lot of tongue weight, but I was able to tow it back. It got pretty good gas mileage. It didn't look like, if you looked at my temperatures and that kind of thing, you wouldn't even know I was towing it. And so I would trust the Gen 3 to tow about 3,000, almost 4,000 pounds on a regular basis, depending on where you're going. So this one's pretty good for towing. I'm still not towing, you know, like half-ton loads, like it's not gonna replace a pickup, that kind of thing. But that's pretty good for what I got. So once again, this guy is the best in that area. As far as miles per gallon, listen, you don't care. I mean, it's an off-road truck from the 90s or early 2000s. Like, they're all gonna kind of suck at this, especially when you put big tires, bumpers, you lift them, all that stuff. However, it's worth mentioning, especially as we're talking about the comfort of it, having to fill up your gas tank a lot is not only expensive, it's annoying, and it's something that is worth considering. I wrote down the same average miles per hour miles per gallon for all of them, about 17 or 15 to 17. That depends. This is with the cars unmodified as well. I think the Gen 3 was getting probably closer to 17 to 19 completely unmodified. My Gen 1 is probably a little higher too. The Gen 2 I think is actually the loser here. I think it gets the worst. Unmodified, they're all between this 15 to 17 or 17 to 19 range if we're optimistic. Now that I've got them all modified, my Gen 1 actually gets the best. Gen 2 is sitting right around like 14.25 miles per gallon, and my Gen 2 is all the way down at like 11.5 or 12.5. So I'm gonna call that one a draw. Like I said, that's not really the point of this, but hopefully this gives you an idea of comfort. No surprise, the newer car wins. Now, is that worth giving up some of the things on the off-road side of things? I'm not 100% sure. You can see that the Gen 2 is a little bit of a mix of both in the sense that it's got more comfort than the Gen 1, but less comfort than the Gen 3, but it's better off-road. So now let's talk about the most important part to me, which is what can you do with these cars? I've built every single one of these from stock into what I would say is probably their final form. And I'm gonna talk about how easy are they to work on, how durable and reliable are they, what are common fault points, and how easy is it to get parts. So let's get into that section so we can figure out who the true winner of all three generations is. All right, now let's talk about my favorite section. Like I mentioned, I want to talk about all these in stock form to give you guys a good idea of like what they're like from the factory, but I've modified all of these and I think a lot of people are doing that. Not a lot of people are buying them and leaving them stock. And so the question really comes up like, how easy is it to modify these? How reliable are they? What am I getting myself into? I want to first start by saying I actually taught myself how to work on cars by working on my Gen 3. It was the first car I ever built, but it was also the first car I really ever worked on. I taught myself how to do everything, just challenging myself to say, if I can do that job, I wonder if I can do this job and this job and this job. And before you know it, I've touched almost every single nut and bolt on that car. It's what gave me the confidence to tackle my Gen 2, which I've also modified very heavily. And I've left my Gen 1 relatively stock because I like that it does that. I like that purpose. So let's talk about these. Let's talk about the ease of modification for all of them. But let's start with just repairs. You got to keep them on the road. All these cars are over 20 years old at this point. The Gen 1 is coming up on 40 years old. And so let's talk about just ease of repairs and things to look out for. Now, some of you older people out there, some of you old school guys are gonna love the Gen 1 because it's carbureted and it's got points ignition, and it's got a manual transmission. Like, it's very basic stuff. There's almost no computer to it. Actually, I don't know if there is a computer to it. And so really easy. And so in that sense, it's really simple. It's super basic. You've got less to go wrong in the Gen 1. There's not a bunch of sensors. I don't even have a check engine light. Like the light doesn't exist in my Gen 1. And so it's just way more simple. I can usually diagnose it on the side of the road. I can usually figure it out by just thinking about air, fuel, spark, and compression. That's what I need. Very basic motor. And so in that sense, very easy to repair if you're familiar with that kind of stuff, if you're familiar with the kind of old school things. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that's gonna seem pretty foreign. It's gonna be pretty difficult. And these two are gonna be more attractive to you because even though it's simpler, some of these other things, especially EFI, make a huge difference. So I'm gonna talk about that with reliability. But let's talk about the ease of repair. The parts on a Gen 2 are usually really strong, so you don't have to repair them as much. However, the strong design makes it kind of complicated to do repairs. And what I mean by that is, you struggle a lot more on a Gen 2 and a Gen 1, but the Gen 2 even more so, to get at certain bolts, to access certain things. The front geometry is a little more complicated than the Gen 3. I find myself struggling with this car more. When I need to do a CV axle in my Gen 3, it's about a 15-minute job to pull it out. With this one, I'm probably looking at like 45 minutes to an hour. And so things are just harder to access on the Gen 2 than the Gen 3. The Gen 2 is a pretty good car with the strength. That's one of the downsides, is a little more complicated to work on. This is not a complicated car by any means, but I think compared to the Gen 3, this is the one I really like to work on. I don't love to work on it, like I'd rather just drive it, but as far as the ease of repair, way easier to repair. And so one of the things I mentioned before is that the Gen 2 has a huge engine that doesn't make a lot of power. The Gen 3's engine bay is a lot more neat and organized. It doesn't feel super cluttered. It's not as clean as the Gen 1. But the Gen 3 is going to be a little more clean, a little more organized. And the modern construction, so that's the independent front suspension as well as the unibody construction and that kind of thing, it lends itself more to the ease of repair. And so instead of having wheel bearings and a hub and that kind of thing, it just has one central hub unit that you just put on the hub assembly. So you pull it on, take it off. Now that being said, you can replace a lot smaller parts on this. So like a wheel bearing, you can just replace the bearing. But in this one, you have to replace the whole hub assembly. So with the modern changes in technology comes a little more of this like throwaway culture. And so even though it's easier to do those repairs, it's meant for ease of repair. So that's really good. You kind of lose out on the sense that you're throwing away a lot of parts. You're changing out a lot of parts where something might actually be good. But it's worth mentioning the electronics in the Gen 3 make it a whole nother beast. Okay, Gen 1, almost no electronics, super basic. Gen 2, it's kind of that middle range. It's not too bad, and it can live without a lot of electronics, so it doesn't need it. The Gen 3, if you don't know about electronics, this one's gonna stump you. Between the traction control and the ABS, the transfer case switches and sensors, the emission control, all that stuff, you're gonna be chasing wires, you're gonna be doing electronic diagnosis. I know because I've done it. I've had to chase down a lot of things. I had something go on where my brake lights stopped working, and so it turned off my ABS. That's so annoying. And so you have to chase that. That is not an easy repair. That's a repair that a lot of regular shops aren't going to want to do. You have to take it to a dealer to get it scanned, blah, blah, blah. So that can be a lot more complicated and can definitely add to the complexity of the repair. So that's worth mentioning about the Gen 3, because even though it's got some good stuff, the modern aspects sometimes hold it back. Let's talk about reliability. Now, you can always get a lemon, you can always get an awesome car. So I'm gonna talk about my experience with these. My experience with my Gen 1 is that I'm always messing with it. There's always something that I'm having to tweak, something that I'm having to replace. I've rebuilt the top end of the motor, I've rebuilt the transmission. I've done a ton of work to this car. It's not that I've neglected it, but I'm still always messing with something. Seems like the fuel is not right sometimes and whatever. I'm always doing something with it. And so it's reliable, it stays on the road. I call it Reliablue because it's my little blue Montero. It's always running when these ones are down, but it's still not something I'd want to take on a road trip like I mentioned before. The Gen 2 is I find very reliable. It's simple. It's got electronic fuel injection, so it's not gonna be as finicky as a carburetor when you're going from hot to cold like we do in Montana or up and down in elevation. To me, this is just right. It's really reliable. Now, that's assuming that your motor's in good working order, that someone's taking care of the transmission, the bushings are in good shape. Obviously, like ease of repair falls into that. If you're not repairing your vehicle, nothing's gonna be reliable. But now that mine's built, now that I've taken the time to actually repair things, it has been running so flawlessly since I rebuilt it. So that's really big. Okay, and then reliability, again with electronics. I know I sound like a broken record. It's my biggest complaint about the Gen 3. I just wish that it had more manual stuff. I wish I could take the manual aspects of the Gen 2 and drop it into the Gen 3, or I could take the motor and put it back, but here we are. So the electronics, they can just be unreliable. Right now I've got this thing going on that's driving me nuts, where whenever I get into dirt or mud or snow, the sensors for the ABS go off and they turn off my traction control, stability control, and braking. And so that's super annoying when I'm driving through terrain where I need all of those things. And so that's not the only electronics that have issues that present with reliability. Like I said, the transfer case is based on this, the traction control, things that make it great off-road, but also things that just make it livable on-road. The electronics are the downfall for sure. Let's talk about durability. So how durable are these things? I will say, if you haven't been around a Montero, if you haven't seen them, then I'm going to tell you this will impress you. These are very, very durable trucks. One of the most frequent comments I get when people see a Montero is they talk about their time overseas, fighting overseas with the military, and they talk about how they had one of these while they were over there and they beat the tar out of it and they were so impressed. I would say, as far as durability of parts, they are as durable, if not more durable, than Toyotas. I know some people want to fight me on that, but they really, really perform well. They take a huge beating. The components are really beefy, and so they're really, really good. That being said, let's talk about which one is the best. The Gen 2 right in the middle here, it's very strong, and it's got really well designed parts. And so the Gen 2 is going to have some of the strongest parts. The differential is basically the size of a Dana 60 in the rear. Everything's pretty well built. It's definitely got probably the least amount of weak points, I would say, in its build. And so the Gen 2, I'm not afraid to really beat on the thing. It's going to take a beating. It's going to hold up. It's going to be really good. The Gen 1 is similar to the Gen 2, but everything's just a little smaller. Everything is smaller on the car in general. But by and large, the parts just aren't quite as strong, or they aren't quite as beefy. They're definitely good, especially for the size and weight of the vehicle. They do just fine, but they aren't as good as the Gen 2. Pretty much everything on the Gen 1 just got a little stronger, little beefier, little better built when it went to the Gen 2. The Gen 3, it's still very strong. Like I said, it's got the same running gear as far as differentials as the Gen 2. However, the independent rear suspension just gives you a lot more stuff to fail. So if you're talking about durability, if you're talking about beating this thing off-road, the solid axle in the Gen 1 and 2 is going to take a lot more abuse than the CV axles, the differential, and the independent rear suspension geometry of the Gen 3. It's just not going to hold up quite as well. And I've actually had a ton of issues with this, as well as just the unibody construction and that kind of thing. It doesn't lend itself as well to some of the durability that you'd want out of a full frame truck. As far as where the mounting points go and that kind of thing, the suspension just changes up so that it's a little more complicated, a little more comfortable on the road, but it's not going to be quite as durable. That being said, I think all of these are extremely durable. If you haven't experienced them, you'd be really impressed with how they work out. Let's talk about parts. This is going to be talking about replacement parts for just maintaining your vehicle. This is no surprise, but the parts get easier to find as it gets newer. So the older Montero, the Gen 1, parts are getting harder to find. Some guys are parting them out. Some companies are really leaning into supplying parts for that. You can still find a lot of parts for them, but most of them are going to come from overseas. When I rebuilt the transmission for this car, that was 2 years ago, it was really hard to find some of the more tiny fiddly parts for it. I was waiting for weeks for things to ship overseas. I was kind of buying them blind because I'm trying to translate websites and that kind of thing. So if you're willing to put in the legwork, you can still find most parts for this car, but they are getting more rare. The Gen 2 is pretty okay. You can go to a regular auto shop, Rock Auto, some places like eBay and whatever, and you can usually find what you're looking for. And maybe it takes a day or two to get to your auto parts store or whatever, but you can usually find what you're looking for. And a lot of OEM parts still exist for the Gen 2. Obviously, Gen 3 is going to be the best. Even though it's a 20-year-old car, there's still a lot of parts for it. Even like new OEM remanufactured, you can probably find the parts for it. Again, you might be waiting a day or two at your auto parts store depending on how big your city is that you live in, but this one's the easiest one to find parts for. If I'm going on a road trip or going down to Moab and I know I'm going to break things, I'm most likely to bring parts for this car. I know that I can probably find the parts I need in Salt Lake City for my Gen 3 if I'm willing to be patient for them. So that's what I got for parts availability, which makes a big difference if you're trying to keep your car on the road. It's also worth mentioning, I have parted out multiple of each one of these generations so that I have my own junkyard, my own stockpile of parts in case they go down. So for me, I've kind of eliminated that issue, but it's good for other people to know. Let's talk about aftermarket support. This is something I'm actually super proud of because the aftermarket support for the Montero is growing as we speak. So that's super cool. When I first got into this, there was a handful of people that knew how to make things happen with Monteros. And now with a couple different companies stepping up, there's a lot more options. And even people are making new aftermarket things for these cars, which is so cool. So there's a couple things you can do. This is not going to be as easy as a Jeep. This is not going to be as easy as a 4Runner or something like a Gladiator. Like those are going to have way, way, way more options. You're going to be pretty limited to a couple brands. Maybe some of them are local, maybe some of them are overseas, and you're going to be pretty limited to what you can actually do. But as far as the aftermarket support goes, bad, good, and best. It goes the same with the parts availability. There's not as many options for the Gen 1. And that's true pretty much across the board. If you want to modify a Gen 1, you're looking at either a lot of custom work or you're looking at like 1 or 2 options. So you can do a lift kit. People make skid plates for it. But as far as bumpers go, bumpers are pretty hard to find. As far as gears and lockers go, kind of limited. There's not a whole lot else you can do. There's a few people making specific things for it, but not that much. That changes when you get to the Gen 2. You can get front and rear lockers. You can get transfer case gears. You can do a lot more with the Gen 2 as far as like options go. So you have a couple different lifts. You have a lot more people who are invested in this platform. You've got specialty parts like things to improve the steering and different bushing options, that kind of thing. The Gen 2 starts to get a little more modifiable. And then the Gen 3, because it's the most recent platform, that has a lot more modifications. So you can get a lot of skid plates for it, a lot of different lift kit options. We're still pretty low on things like bumpers and accessories. There's just not a lot of them. So when we're talking about aftermarket modifications, we're talking about some parts upgrades, lift kits, skid plates, maybe some sliders. I think the Gen 3 has some slider options, but I've made custom sliders for all mine. And that gets me into another point I want to talk about with the aftermarket is if you're looking for something where you can just bolt it on, or you can just show up at a shop and they can slap stuff on, a Montero is probably not for you. You can do wheels, lift, and tires. That's not bad. You can get a skid plate set and slap it on in a weekend. That's not that big deal. But if you want to do something like fully built from a calendar, just like drag and drop, that's really tough. I have done almost all of the work to these cars myself, and I've done a lot of custom stuff, which means welding, grinding, fabrication, dreaming it up, getting it set on the vehicle. It's been a lot of work, and that's mostly because there's just not that much support for it. That being said, Adventure Driven Design and LusoOverland.com are going to be huge assets to you if you're looking to build one of those. They've got a lot of the resources that you need as far as like getting you attached to the information that helps you get the part that you need. They've also got the widest selection of options for you. So those are my 2 go-tos as far as here in the United States, but that's how I feel about the modifications as far as the aftermarket support for them. Then let's talk about the ease of modifications. So it doesn't do you any good if you can do all these mods to your car, but they're super hard to do. This is kind of the other side of ease of repair, and it follows a similar track. The biggest bang for buck is going to be your Gen 2. You can do a torsion bar crank on this, so just turn the torsion bars up and a body lift for like $150, and you can run 35-inch tires no problem. That's a huge advantage where you get the Toyotas and some of these other newer cars where you're having to cut out the firewall, you're having to push back the body mounts, you're having to do tons of work just to fit an inch bigger tire. I ran 35s on my Gen 2 for about $120. That's pretty awesome. And it actually wasn't that much work either. Like a body lift, it's pretty cheap. Cranking up the torsion bars, you can do in 15 minutes. And so there's a lot of bang for buck that you can do with a Gen 2 to make it like really capable off-road right off the bat. Then you get into stuff like transfer case gears and differential gears. That requires a whole new set of tooling, but most gear shops can do that for you. But there's a lot of bang for buck right here. I think it's the strongest off-road platform, but also I find it's the easiest to modify, to change things up, and to get a lot of advantage out of. So that's my pick. The Gen 1 is, there's not a lot of modifications. So there's not a lot of modifications you can do. There's just not a ton of mods to do on it, but very similar in the sense that you can just crank up the torsion bars, you can do a body lift and do the same thing. And so these are, because they're very similar construction, the modifications are pretty easy on a Gen 1 as well. Now, you're obviously more limited in what you can do with it just because of the nature of the size of it. So you can't build out a sleeping platform or anything like that in it. But it's a fun little thing to mess with. And there's tons of room in the engine bay to put things like compressors or whatever. So that one's pretty good for modification, but not as good as the Gen 2. The Gen 3 has got a lot more bolt-on stuff. And so if you're looking for something that's just going to be the easiest to modify, it's going to have the most options and probably the most people who are into it right now to help you along the way, the Gen 3 is going to be where it's at. And like I said, there's still people coming out with new stuff for the Gen 3. It's hard to believe. I don't know how much longer it's going to last. But as of right now, that one's got quite a bit of stuff, especially if you go to lusooverland.com. He's got tons and tons of stuff for the Gen 3 because that's how he got started in Monteros as well. And so as far as the ease of modifications, there's going to be a lot more bolt-on stuff. And this is where you start to get into the accessories too a little bit. There's guys who are making molly panels for the back windows and some accessories that go on the back door. There's even little drawers and slide-ins you can do for the rear. And so if you're someone who, and this is not a knock or whatever, but you're like the custom world, not for me. I want to drag and drop. I want to pick it out of a catalog and I want to put it in my car. The Gen 3 is definitely going to be the way to go. These other two are going to require a little more customization, a little more fabrication, and a little more investment in actually knowing the specialty tools or whatever to do something like diffs and gears. It's also worth mentioning there are transfer case gears available for the Gen 3 as well as lockers. So if you want to go that route, you can go that route. So there's availability for all of that. All right, so there's a lot of information about all three generations. Now let's talk about which one I like the best. This is just my personal opinion for what I do. Living here in Montana, I get out on the trail quite a bit. I go camping almost every weekend in the summer. I also need a car that's going to really handle the weather in the winter. I need something to tow my snowmobiles and dirt bikes. And so I want to talk about which one of these is my favorite. It's also worth mentioning, I wrench on my cars. I've never had a mechanic touch any of my three generations. I've done all the modifications, I've done all the maintenance, I've done all the repairs myself. And so I'm gonna look at this through that experience, knowing what I've been through with each car and how I think it performs. So let's talk about which one wins for comfort. This one is no surprise for you guys. That's gonna be the Gen 3. So this one is going to be the most comfortable. It's going to be the most modern. If I'm going on a road trip, if I'm just trying to cruise through town, I like taking the Gen 3 because it's just the most comfortable. It's also my wife's daily driver. So I built this car, I modified it, I got it all set up exactly how I wanted, and then I decided my wife's Subaru was boring. I decided to sell it, take the profits, put it into the Gen 2, and I gave her the Gen 3. She drives it every day. She gets tons of looks and comments, but for her, even though it's a little more stiff, it's a big lifted car, it's very comfortable. She has no problem doing her errands, getting to work, whatever, visiting friends in that car. And it's fun because she has a car that she can take anywhere in Montana. And so she's going to the ski hill, going out hiking with some friends. It's no problem for her. So for comfort, it's the Gen 3. Now, this won't surprise any of you either, but for off-roading, it's going to be the Gen 2. I really like the Gen 2. I think as far as an off-road platform, it's got the best bones. It's got the best out-of-the-box performance. And then when you pair it with the ease of modification to take it to that next level, this is the move. When I had my Gen 3 fully built, I had a Gen 2, this Gen 2, with just a little bit of lift, torsion bar crank, and 33s. And I think this Gen 2, with almost no money into it, could go almost everywhere that the Gen 3 could. It's got better ground clearance, it's got better flex, so it's able to move. The locker really puts it over the top. I think this Gen 2 with almost no money into it is just as good as my fully built Gen 3. So for off-roading, for sure, the Gen 2. Now this wasn't a category on here, but what is the Gen 2 or Gen 1 good for? Fun. It's just a fun car. I just really like it. I call it my date car. It feels ridiculous to drive around town in it. You get tons of looks. I love the stick shift. I love that it's a quirky four-wheel drive box. And so the Gen 1 is just flat out fun for me. So even though it doesn't actually add up on any of the lists, like it's not the most comfortable, it's not the best at repair, it's not the most modifiable, I like it because it's just flat out fun. And that leads me to the big question that a lot of people are asking me is, if you could only keep one, if you only had one, if you had to pick, what's your favorite Montero out of all three generations? And that one's gonna have to go to the Gen 2. This is my favorite one. If I had to sell all of them, it'd be really hard to sell all of them. I wouldn't want to. I love keeping all of them. But the Gen 2 is my personal daily driver. So I drive, it's lifted, it has no sway bars, it's triple locked, it's on 35s, and I drive it every single day and I love it. I'm not afraid to take it on a road trip. I'm not afraid to tow things with it. And I know that I can tackle some of the baddest trails here in Montana by just showing up with this thing. And so I love the Gen 2. That's my personal favorite pick. If you're out there looking for a Montero and you're like me, where you want something that you can daily drive, it's manageable, but you really want it to shine off-road, the Gen 2 is for you. If you're looking for something that's gonna go off-road occasionally, do some dirt roads, some light trails, but you mostly want it to be a grocery getter, more comfortable in the city, the Gen 3 is for you. And if you just like that old, weird, quirky stuff, and you just want like something old and nostalgic, go with the Gen 1. That's the move for sure. That being said, even though I'm kind of starting to distance some of these from each other, I'm saying this one's better than that one and yada yada, they're all really good. A Gen 3 is a very impressive off-road vehicle, especially with some good modifications. You would be shocked at how far it gets. And a Gen 2 is a lot more comfortable than some things like old Jeep Cherokees or XJs or YJs. Like it actually bridges the gap here. It feels a little bit like a Land Cruiser, not only in its capability, but its comfort level. And the Gen 1, even though it's 40-year-old technology, this thing still gets out and boogies on the trail. Super fun. I love cruising around town with it. I love that it has four-wheel drive, so here in Montana, I can daily it in the winter. And so I really think all these generations are awesome. Some of them have better strengths than others, and so that's why I wanted to make this video. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, if you want to fight me on something, if you believe that one is better than the other, let me know in the comments. But that's my take on which one of the Monteros is best for me and a breakdown of the comparison between all three generations.